All right, we are now recording.
That's what ours looks like.
So let's go ahead and
we're already subscribed.
open in prayer. Deepak, would you like to open us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, thank you for evening service. Thank you that we get to go to a church where we get to enjoy not one but two good teachings every Sunday. And thank you for the book of Revelation. Thank you that it is that even though thank you for you that you are here with us, and your spirit will help us understand what you have in store for us. And I pray that you would be with us and open our hearts and minds to what you have. I ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Okay, so I think I got everybody notes one way or the other. Either got a paper copy or an electronic copy or both. It is recorded. So last week we started it, and we're entitling this whole series on Revelation, The Tale of Two Cities, Babylon and the New Jerusalem. Augustine called it the city of God and the city of man in his book, The City of God. We could easily call it, like I said last week, Tale of Two Women, the harlot and the bride. But I've settled on Tale of Two Cities, Babylon and the New Jerusalem. We went through a brief introduction, a brief overview of it, and looked at who the author is and when and why it was written. Good evening, Ian.
Hello.
And right there's a set of notes. I didn't have your email address, so I couldn't email them to you.
That's right.
So anyway, just to remind you, what we saw last week is Revelation.
It's Jan's dog.
Oh, okay. No problem, Jan.
They are to me, I'll tell you that. I'm sorry.
They didn't like what I was teaching already, and I just was on the first paragraph.
Yeah, they're sure hard to please, aren't they?
Okay, so what we saw last week is that Revelation was probably written in the, I've got in the notes, early 90s. It was probably 94, 95. Domitian, I'm getting my Roman emperors mixed up. Domitian died around 80, 96. And it was written toward the end of his reign. So probably 95 or 94. It was when it was written. And it was written to churches in Asia Minor facing sporadic persecution in connection with the imperial cult. And we talked about the imperial cult last week, about how there's no getting away from it and how it's, and you can read, I've got that written down in the notes, how it is inextricably intertwined with the commercial life, the political life, and all of that. And so
I'll have to take
Christians really were forced to confront this. They didn't have much of a choice. And that was where the persecution was coming in. So anyway, I won't review all of that. I'll let you read it so you can brush up on it. Tonight, we've got two important questions to answer. Next week, believe it or not, we will be able to get started in the text itself. But these two questions we're going to look at tonight: what kind of literature is Revelation, and how should we nowadays read the book of Revelation? those two questions will significantly impact the rest of our study. So I want you, if you're not understanding or if you have questions, please interrupt. Just shoot the hand up or call out my name. If you don't know my name, it's just, hey, you. But just stop me and ask questions.
Hey, you, I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering if everybody could mute because we're getting a lot of feedback and it's hard to hear you. There's like a squeaky noise, and if everybody mutes unless you have something to say, that might help since there's more people than we normally have or what we were having before.
Well, we have one person coming in by telephone, and that's probably part of it is. But I think next week, Deepak has a way that we can put her on the, up on the TV too, and then we probably won't have all the feedback.
And even on the phone, you should be able to mute though. But anyway, that's my 2 cents.
No, you're right. So we'll work on that.
Okay, thank you.
All righty.
If we put it away from the computer over here, it will be less. There we go. Is that better? She's
Yes,
muted.
it is. It is better.
Okay, very good. All right. So let's just jump right into it. This first of the remaining questions we have. What kind of literature is it? That is, what kind of literature is Revelation? May seem like a strange question to ask, but this is a very important question for us to answer because knowing the kind of literature or the genre of a book helps us understand it because it gives us a certain expectation that helps us understand its meaning. Let me give you an example. What applies to books also applies to movies. So if you're watching a movie, you start a movie and you see a spaceship fly over an alien planet, you know you're watching what? Sci-fi. Yes, you know you're watching sci-fi, and you expect to see aliens, advanced technologies, created new worlds, and all of that. And you would expect the things that normally that you wouldn't see in ordinary or experience in ordinary human life, you would expect in that sci-fi movie. And you would expect that those things would be very important elements of how the story unfolds. So the mere fact that you know it's sci-fi gives you certain expectations for understanding that movie. Now, compare that to a historical period piece like Pride and Prejudice. Okay, if you're watching Pride and Prejudice and all of a sudden an alien bursts suddenly and violently out of the chest of Mr. Darcy, you would be thrown for a loop. You wouldn't know what in the world is going on. You wouldn't have a frame of reference for how this fits into the story. So what you would expect to see in a sci-fi movie would be totally confusing in a historical period piece. Does that make sense? It's the same way when it comes to literature. Understanding what style of literature Revelation is will help us understand it because it'll give us certain expectations of what we're going to encounter and how to handle those things. Okay, does that make sense? Now, think about this for a moment. If we read the book of Revelations as a historical narrative of events, like the book of Acts, if we read like we read the book of Acts, totally unclear, and in fact, hard to believe.
You're muffled for me, Mike, and I swear I thought you said Revelations.
Did I? Oh, my stars. That's a Freudian slip.
But that must have been just on my end.
He just wanted to see if you'd catch it.
That's right.
It's the static on the line.
I wish as quick as Pam.
Hey, make sure that you were muffled a little bit there, but I'll go off.
Right, so let me say it clearly. Revelation. Oh, my stars. So again,
Still gets a gold star.
he does. Yes. Good job, Philip. So we read the book of Acts as a historical narrative of actual events. That is not the way we read Revelation. That does not mean that the book of Revelation is not connected to actual historical events. It does not mean that Revelation does not symbolically portray or depict actual historical events. But we do not read Revelation as a narrative of historical events the way we read the book of Acts as a narrative. Otherwise, you'd be totally grossed out reading that book. And you would think that it's a sci-fi book. Okay, so that's why it's important to us. And I think we'll see going on even more why it's important to us. Can you hand me my phone? So I know where to keep track of the time. Got to make sure I'm not blabbing on, that I'm making progress here. That's why they tell running backs, go forward, not laterally. You want to make progress. So we actually see in the first 4 verses of Revelation that John indicates for us what kind of book he wrote. Wasn't that good of John to tell us what kind of a book he wrote? So those first 4 verses, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace, and so on and so forth to finish the verse. What we have and what I read there is indications of 3 different kinds of literature that apply to the book of Revelation. Notice the title, the Revelation. The Greek word there is apocalypsis, and that's where they get the word apocalyptic from. The Greek word itself, not necessarily the style of literature, but the Greek word itself means unhidden, unveiled. Something was veiled or hidden, and it's been unveiled. It's been revealed, and that's why it's translated revelation. But there is a genre of literature called apocalyptic. And Revelation uses it. It uses this literature, this style of literature called apocalyptic. This style of literature appeared between, I mean, you read various time periods that whenever you read up on this stuff, not everybody agrees on the same range of time. So it appeared between and became popular between 400 AD and 200 BC. However, it became very popular among Jewish people, and there were many Jewish apocalyptic books written from 200 AD to 200 BC to 100 AD. Okay, so in that 300-year period, lots of Jewish works, the apocalypse of Moses, of Abraham. There's For Esdra and several others. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there are several others. And they were very popular amongst the Jewish people. But all of these apocalyptic works that the Jewish people wrote, all of them were built on similar material that was found in the Old Testament, in the books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah. I've got the chapters written right there in the notes for you. You read those chapters in those books and you're going to see, oh yeah, this is kind of like what John does in the book of Revelation. So the question is, why did they write in that kind of style? Why did God use that style of literature to communicate his truth to us? Why? What is the point of it? It's so very foreign to us. It was quite familiar to the Jews, and so it would have been quite familiar to John's audience. Well, the primary intent, and I've tried to say in these next couple of paragraphs, I've tried to say it, explain it 3 different ways, because this is, I think, is really important for us to understand what apocalyptic literature is. The primary intent of these kind of readings is to contrast, on one hand, the ultimate otherworldly realm of or nature of God's realm with the, on the other hand, the temporary misleading realm of this world. And I'll explain in a minute why I use that word misleading. I'm not saying that this physical realm doesn't really exist and all of that. But as we experience it, a lot of times we experience it feeling like that's all there is to reality. This is all of true reality to us. It's all what we see. We don't see the supernatural realm. That's unseen. And so a lot of the times we just go through life treating the earthly realm, that which we can see, as true reality, the true reality, when in fact it's not. This earthly realm is soon to be judged, destroyed, and disappear. So it's illusory or misleading in that sense. Does that make sense? Okay. So what they do, in apocalyptic writings, they flip the realms. The supernatural realm that's unseen, behind the scenes, is brought to the forefront. It becomes the true reality. The earthly realm recedes to the background. to behind the scenes. And that's what you're reading in these passages in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah. It's what you'll read in the book of Revelation. What you're reading is what is going on in the spiritual realm. The earthly realm has receded to the background, behind the scenes. They're still connected, okay? But now you're seeing as the true reality the heavenly, the supernatural realm, not the earthly realm, okay? Now, to depict what's going on in the supernatural realm, they use really vivid imagery. And this imagery is used purposely. It is supposed to be very evocative, emotionally evocative. That is emotionally expressive or even graphic. And the reason they use that kind of imagery is to reach out and grab your imagination, grab our imagination and hold it. And not just grab it and hold it, but engage us. And we're not only engaged in trying to figure out what this symbolism means, but once we get a clue as to what this symbolism mean, it engages us morally, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, where it portrays what's going on in the spiritual realm in such a way that if we're someone who is, if we're a believer that's experiencing persecution, this imagery, we see what's going on behind the scenes, that the earthly powers are about to be, God is about to intervene and destroy those earthly powers and rescue us. And we see that vividly portrayed in the spiritual realm by this imagery. And so that imagery grabs us and engages us, and in such a way that it says, oh yeah, man, this stuff is passing away. I just need to hang on. Or if we're a believer and we're being seduced by the world, the things that the world offers, we're being seduced by the city of man, the way Augustine would put it, then what we see what's portrayed in the spiritual realm. We see how the city of man has destroyed believers, how it tramples down believers. We see vividly portrayed what we're really toying with. And so it engages us and warns us, don't give in to this seduction. So that's the point of apocalyptic. It's written to people that are in perilous times, and it's written in such a way that the spiritual realm is in the foreground, the earthly realm recedes to the background, and it uses vivid imagery to grab us and engage us what is really going on. If you're suffering persecution, hang on, because this stuff that's going on is about to disappear. If you're being seduced in this by this, I'm trying to not look at the misbehaving of Pat.
Well, let me just say this, and I know this is being recorded so the whole world can hear it. I told him he had to behave, but there is someone who is misbehaving and did it. He didn't do it this time. I'm not saying who it was, but somebody else is misbehaving, not just Pat. And Pat was not misbehaving.
Okay.
He just got pulled into it.
Thank you, Joe. Thank
Well, you know, I would be the first to say, yes, it's his fault, but this time it isn't. I do have a question, Mike. You had mentioned those other, the scriptures in the Old Testament, and I thought you said that it was listed on the notes, but I'm not I see some references. I see a list of references, but it looks like they're all in Revelation.
No, you see the first bullet point there? Revelation uses a style of literature called apocalyptic. We're
Which is,
starting on the third page.
okay, on the third page.
What kind of literature?
Okay, I got that.
Those other questions before that is what we covered last week.
Okay.
Okay.
But
So
this
what
is,
kind of literature is it? That first bullet item?
huh?
Revelation uses a style of literature called apocalyptic. The last sentence of that paragraph, all of those, all of them, the them refers to the apocalyptic works written by the Jews. Boy, did I misinterpret what was going on. Anyway, I said all of it are built on similar material found in Old Testament books like Isaiah, chapters 24 through 27, Ezekiel, chapters 1 and 2.
I don't have that.
39.
I don't think it's on the notes we got.
Yeah, I don't see that either, Mike.
Oh, my stars. Did I send you the wrong notes?
Well, they're on Revelation.
I don't
And
know.
And the,
about, what kind of literature is it? And
Can you hold up to your camera the front page of your notes?
probably backwards.
Yeah. No. That's the notes. This is the page you're showing me, right?
go the bottom, Joe.
That's well, let me look again. Yeah, but that's the bottom. I just don't see that reference where it says what kind of literature.
Well, that sentence is doesn't end right. It doesn't have a completion to the last line on the page, Mike.
Hold that up again.
The email note?
Show the bottom, Joe,
Last week, yeah.
of the page.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if the bottom is what.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. No, that's not the page I have.
I don't know how that happened because
Is there something missing there that's supposed to be there?
okay. What I'll do is I will send out the other notes. That's really weird because
So is there just a section or a page is missing or what?
I don't know. Do you probably, let me see your page on how should we read it today.
Say that again. How should we read it today?
Okay.
Well, that starts at the bottom of that page that I was just showing you. And then it just has a couple of lines on the next page.
Oh, how did that happen?
I don't know the answer to that.
The Reader's Digest version.
Is that the same kind of notes that you have, Tim and Nick?
I think
I
so.
just emailed you
I
guys the updated notes, Pat, Joe.
Okay, Tim just emailed you the updated notes.
Okay.
Give me a copy too, will you, Tim?
I don't so and I think my mom has the same thing. So, okay, I'm gonna freeze real quick because I'm gonna check my email. So, because I'm on my phone.
Well, okay,
Wait a minute.
being recorded for everybody. See, I'm sorry. I don't know
That
how
was a bad freeze one. I don't want that look too. Let me do this one. No. I'll do this one. There you go. Okay. Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Well, I'll continue on, just simply because we're being recorded here. And then, well, we can go on. Okay, here we go. So apocalyptic, to sum up, apocalyptic is a style of genre, style of literature or a genre, with its own rules and symbols. And it's extensive symbolism that makes Revelation so hard to interpret. And here's something we're going to have to get used to that is particularly true regarding numbers. Revelation uses the numbers 4, 7, 10, 12, and most of those numbers symbolically. That would argue against interpreting those numbers literally. But what do we mean by literal? When we interpret something as literal, what do we mean by that? What we mean by is that we interpret it the way you normally read it, with all of the grammar and the style of literature that it is. So you would interpret figures of speech as figures of speech in a literal interpretation. So if Revelation is apocalyptic and John is using symbolism here to portray events and persons, then we need to interpret his symbols as just that, being symbolic. Now, obviously, the next question that jumps to your mind is, well, what are the rules for interpreting symbols, symbolic language? Well, I don't know if we'll get much into it tonight, but we will definitely cover that in the course of going through Revelation. How can we know what meaning to assign to these symbols and this symbolism? All right. But the point that I'm emphasizing here is because it's apocalyptic, it means we're dealing with extensive symbolism. And so we need to be sensitive to that and interpret this, what John, if these numbers are being used symbolically, we need to interpret them symbolically because that's the way John intended it to be interpreted. That will probably become a little more clear as we go through and we start encountering these symbols and dealing with them. And then of course, what we've talked about already, another key feature of apocalyptic is its claim to offer a divine perspective on history. That's the same thing as saying the writer flipped the spiritual realm and the earthly realm. By bringing the spiritual realm, the supernatural realm rather, to the forefront and pushing the earthly realm to the background, we're now looking at history from heaven's perspective, from God's perspective. Okay? So John is in Revelation, he is showing us the world, the real world in which we live, but he's looking at it from the perspective of heaven. Okay? And in doing that, he uses real vivid imagery and symbols to depict that that heavenly view of history, that supernatural realm. Now, the first readers of Revelation would have been quite familiar with this style of literature and would have read the book just like John intended it to be read. That's going to be an important question to us all the way through the book of Revelation. How would the first century church have read this passage? Okay. But we also see in verse 3 that John describes Revelation as a book of prophecy. As a matter of fact, he refers to the Revelation as a prophecy 4 different times. 5 different times. Once here in verse 3, and then the other 4 occurrences are in the last chapter, chapter 22. Revelation is the capstone or the climax of biblical revelation, because as such, it takes up all the other threads of prophecy and weaves them together in this narrative of God's grand plan for his creation. So Revelation is a prophecy. It is the capstone of biblical revelation. And as a prophecy, it functions 2 ways. As a prophecy, it certainly forecasts future events, future expectations that are associated with the second coming of Christ or the return of Christ. But it also exhorts its readers to behave a certain way in response. That's the same thing that Wes was saying this morning when he's talking about the foretelling function of prophecy and the forthtelling of prophecy. Prophecy forecasts. Prophecy also exhorts, rebukes, encourages. That's the forthtelling function of prophecy. And so we see that in John. So Revelation is a prophecy that was written to call the church to persevering faith and action in perilous times. You know, the church has been in perilous times from its inception. It's just that many of us in the Western world have come to be quite insulated from some of those perilous things. And that insulation is kind of unraveling, isn't it? Kind of falling apart. So another thing that I want you to understand is, although apocalyptic is the most notable feature, I mean, that's so noticeable. You start reading Revelation and it just jumps up and the dragon bites you on the nose. That's how noticeable the apocalyptic aspects of Revelation are. But it's more accurate to describe it as a prophecy. A prophecy that uses apocalyptic aspects. And so commentators and scholars have taken to calling it prophetic apocalyptic for everybody that loves $65,000 words. there's one you can add to your vocabulary. No, Revelation is prophetic, apocalyptic. Okay. Now here's something that you might not known before, but that although John does not quote a single Old Testament passage, and here he is. Revelation is the capstone of biblical revelation. He's weaving together all of these prophetic threads, and in all 22 books, not a single Old Testament passage is quoted. However, it is stuffed full of Old Testament allusions. I believe one author I read said something in the 270s, the high 200s, allusions to the Old Testament. He alludes to the Old Testament, but he expects you to pick up on it. He doesn't say, like Isaiah said, or like Daniel said. He just alludes to something out of the Old Testament, and we are expected to pick up on it. He expects his listeners to be familiar with the Old Testament, even conversant with it. And so the most important background for interpreting Revelation is the Old Testament. And that's where we're going to go a lot to understand, to try to assign meaning to the symbols, the symbolism that he uses in the book of Revelation. We'll be using the Old Testament a lot for that. Okay? But Revelation is also a letter. And we saw in verse 4 how he opens Revelation as a letter. John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia. By the way, he said the 7 churches that are in Asia. Here's a clue that 7 is being used symbolically, because there were more churches in Asia. There were churches in more cities than the 7 cities that we find in Asia in Revelations 2 and 3. So there's more churches than what he addresses in chapters 2 and 3. So he's using the 7 to stand for all of the churches. 7 stands for completeness. We're going to see. Anyway, you can see he opens and closes the book according to the conventions of first century letter writing. And here's the important thing about reading letters. Just like we do with other New Testament letters, take the book of Ephesians or Romans or Galatians. They were written to specific people or churches to address the specific situation they were facing. So in reading Romans, we want to put ourselves in the place of the believers in that Roman church. See how what Paul wrote to them in the book, his letter to the Romans, would apply to them. Once we see how it applies to those original readers, we can apply it to ourselves. And Revelation is no different. It's just like all the other New Testament letters. It's just that it's a little harder to see how it applies to the original readers. That step is a little more difficult. So Revelation is a prophecy that uses an apocalyptic style and was preserved by a letter. So when we get into it, we're going to interpret the symbols as symbols. And we're going to use the rest of the Bible to try to figure out these symbols. And we're going to try to put ourselves in the shoes of those first century Christians, see how that how Revelation impacted them. Whatever passage in Revelation that we're reading, we're going to see how that would impact them. How would they understand that? How would they read that? How would that impact them? How would that apply themselves? Then we're going to turn the pointer to us. So then how does it apply to us? Okay, does that make sense? Now, this next question, how should we read it today? And I've just got written down there for you. Because of its symbolism, Revelation has proved to be one of the most difficult books of the Bible to interpret. For centuries, interpreters have wrestled with the book only to produce widely different explanations, widely different ways of reading Revelation. And so we have to ask ourselves, so how should we read it? Scholars identify 4 ways in which the book can be read. We have to decide, in choosing between in these different ways, we have to decide, is Revelation mostly history, mostly future, or mostly principles? Let's just go through these real quickly. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or say, hey, you, like Joe did. This first approach, or this first view, is called preterist, and it interprets the majority of Revelation as symbolically representing real people and events that occurred in the first century. Now, if you're wondering, where in the world did the word preterist come from? I already asked that question and already researched it. The prefix preter comes from a Latin word that means past or beyond. So a preterist is one who concentrates on the past, in this case, the first century. Okay? So because this approach reads Revelations, got it, there I go again. Reads Revelation as symbolically representing real people and events that occurred in the first century. We say this view is stuck in the past. They're concentrating, as far as how they read Revelation, they're concentrating on the first century. So it's called preterist. The second view, historicist, interprets Revelation as symbolically forecasting world history from Christ onward. Now, think about that. The way you would interpret Revelation would depend on what century you lived in. If you treated Revelation as forecasting world history, if you lived in the 5th century, you're going to come up with a different interpretation of Revelation than someone that lives in the 21st century, right? And so after a few centuries, this was popular for a while, maybe a century or two, and not early, but late, maybe a century or two. But it fell to mostly disuse. So we're not even going to look at it. We're not even going to consider it. So just moving on to that third view, futurist. The futurist view interprets the majority of Revelation as symbolically representing real people and events which will take place in the future. Events just before and after Christ's return. And there are quite a variety of futurist approaches. And by the way, there's quite a variety of preterist approaches. There's partial, full, liberal, evangelical. There's several different approaches of preterist and futurist. And also futurists, of those that futurists tends to be the most popular approach to Revelation. Then this fourth one is idealist. The idealist approach interprets Revelation as a symbolic portrayal of good versus evil. The good versus evil that's portrayed in the book of Revelation is normally God, the conflict between God and God's people and God's enemies. Okay? God and God's people on one side and God's enemies on the other side. That's the good and evil that's typically portrayed. So anyway, Revelation is a symbolic portrayal of good versus evil and of spiritual realities that believers at any time in history face, such as persecution or warfare. And the thing to note about the idealist is that it disconnects the symbolism from real events that took place in the first century or that will take place in the future. The idealist disconnects it from real events and real people. And there's various types of idealist views too. So the thing to keep in mind here, preterists, they're tying everything to the first century. Futurists, they're tying everything to the future, including beyond our time. Okay? And idealists, they're disconnecting it from real events and people. So, not surprisingly, no single approach captures exactly what John is doing here. As a matter of fact, many evangelical scholars, commentators use a mixed approach. They combine elements from 3 of the 4 approaches: preterist, futurist. Okay, and that's the approach I take. I use that approach. And so what does that mean? What would a mixed approach mean? How does it combine those 3? Well, a mixed approach affirms that John used these symbols to make real connection with first century persons and events. Okay? The beast is Nero in Rome. Okay? We can say. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be other godless, oppressive governments throughout the history of the world. And it also doesn't mean there's not going to be a future godless, God-opposing government in the future, closer to the return of Christ. Okay, but the preterist at least has this right that you need to connect it to the persons and events in the first century. So we're going to be asking ourselves, when we start looking at these symbols, the first readers, the first century Christians, how would they have read it? And it's going to entail looking at the events and personages of the first century. And it's right that we do that. However, these same symbols also will have a genuine historical fulfillment in the final days of the second coming of Christ. Okay? And that's futurist. The futurists have it right. There's going to be genuine historical fulfillment of John's symbols in the final days of the second coming of Christ. But then this approach also affirms that John uses these symbols to portray the timeless nature of the battle between God and his enemies, which is the idealist approach. The idealists are right. As a matter of fact, the idealists have the big message of the book. The futurists and the preterists don't disagree that John's symbols portray the battle between God and his enemies. Okay, the futurists have the big message right, but they disconnect it from events and people that are going on in the first century, in the intervening centuries, and in the final days before Christ's return. These symbols are connected to real events and people. So that's why that's why I take elements of all three. Now the trick is how much of each. That's the trick. And those that take a mixed approach, they're all over the map as to how much of each they take. And we'll just find out as we go through, okay? Now, what I wanted to do tonight was simply walk you through those two questions: the type of literature that Revelation is and the kind of approach that we need to take in reading and interpreting the book of Revelation. I mean, significantly impact our understanding of. I don't expect you to memorize all this. That's why I wrote it down, but I just wanted to walk you through it so you'll have it in your mind as we start going through the text next week. Now, I've got one other question here, and then I'll talk to you. I wrote down here, what are the most difficult interpretive issues in the book of Revelation? You might have come up with a different list. Maybe there's some things on here that surprise you. Maybe there's some things that surprises you that are not on here, that they are not on here. But really,
Could you read those? Because we still don't have that portion of your notes.
Oh, okay. I've got 4 of them listed. One of the most difficult interpretive issues in Revelation is the relationship between the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments. Are they strictly consecutive? Are they telescoping? Are they repetitive? Repetitive? Recapitulation was the word I was trying to use. Do they recapitulate? Do the trumpets recapitulate the seals and the bowls recapitulate the trumpets? That's one of the real thorny questions in the book of Revelation. And it remains so. It is hard to answer that question. Another one, it comes in Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 through 17, and that is the 144,000 and the unnumbered multitude. What is that? What is John symbolizing there? What is he talking about?
You could ask the Jehovah's Witness.
Yes, I have, and I wasn't satisfied.
Oh, surprise, surprise.
And then the third one I've got down there, the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11. Who are they? Are they 2 individuals? Are they Moses and Elijah? Or are the two witnesses something else? That remains a thorny question. And then the thorniest of them all, and this may surprise you, the thorniest of them all is, well, at least it's up there with the relationship of the sealed trumpet and bowl judgments, but it may exceed it, and that is the millennium in the first 10 verses of Revelation 20. Because when we get there and we go through it, what we are going to see is it doesn't matter which view you take, you are left with problems that are very hard. The pre-mill view is left with problems that just drive the all-mill people away from concluding pre-mill. And the same thing, the all-mill position leaves problems that drives the pre-mill people away because they view it's they're different problems, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But I just want you to understand, this is one of the toughest interpretive issues in the book of Revelation, not because people have preconceived notions, but because no matter what view you take, you are left with thorny problems that your view has to deal with. So that's why after so many years, we haven't figured it out. Okay. So
George Fox, oh, I'm sorry.
well, go ahead.
Mike, didn't George Fox say something like Dr. Fox, something like he was pan-millennial, he figured that everything's going to pan out in the long run?
Yes, and James has adopted that.
Oh, okay.
That's on his business.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, you're right.
Later on.
Right. Yes, yeah. They keep changing the number.
Right.
Yes, they do.
It died off.
Yes, it did. It did. It did. So, sorry for the long 2-week, well, I'm kind of sorry for the long 2-week introduction, but not really. Next week, we get to start diving into the actual text. But keep these introductory notes close at hand. And Phil and well, let's stop the repeat, and then I can ask you some questions. Okay. Ian, would you like to say a prayer?